If we're going to engage in the sampling process, we need to first complete the first two steps, defining the target population and identifying the sampling frame. First, a little terminology. When we use the phrase population in the context of sampling, what we mean is the entire group that is intended to be covered by the current study. In many cases, we don't actually know the actual size or quantity of this group, and that's fine. A sample is a subset of the group that should be representative of the entire group. Sometimes we use the phrase sampling unit, the basic level of data that is collected as part of our sampling process. In marketing research, the sampling unit is most typically an individual consumer, sometimes a household, but it could be other things as well, especially in the case of B2B research. When a census is conducted, a census is when we have data on the entire population, every single individual. Census, as used here, is a statistical term, meaning we have every single person we have. The U.S. Census does not necessarily collect information about every single person in the United States, it just intends to, so a small distinction there in terminology. Okay, so our first step to do a sampling procedure is to define the target population. Who defines the target population in a study? The answer to that is the researcher defines the target population. We typically work with management, but it's ultimately up to us to have a good, crisp, appropriate definition for our population of interest. Let's give a few examples of unspecific target populations and then examples of more specific, appropriate target populations. Perhaps this first one here, all current customers, a very common population definition for marketing studies. Very quickly we realize that's not very specific. What constitutes being current? 30 days? 60 days? A year? A specific target population might be customers who have bought from us at least once in the last year. Notice I'm not suggesting that this is the only way to define what a current customer is, but we have to find a definition that's appropriate for that particular company. How about SDSU students loyal to the football team? What's the problem here? We have issues with the word students, and more problematically, we need to understand what loyal is defined as. So one way we might approach this is saying SDSU students registered in fall 2019, or the appropriate year, and have attended at least one SDSU game while a student and or have watched at least one SDSU football game on television during the 2019 season. Now the nice thing about this definition is that it is specific and clear. We clearly know what makes a student qualify or not qualify. The question of whether loyalty can be defined as attending a game or watching one game on television can certainly be debated, but now see that's the actual advantage of having a specific target population. We can actually have a more meaningful argument about whether we do or do not want to include a specific person based on specific criteria. Finally, consider defining a specific unsatisfied customers. Again, the problem is what constitutes an unsatisfied customer. A more specific target population might be customers with an active paid account and have either scored us a 3 or below on a satisfaction survey in the last year or registered a complaint through email or phone correspondence in the last year. Two things that could readily be captured in a CRM system. And again, room for argument for any given company about whether this constitutes unsatisfied customers, but the clear specific criteria makes it so that we understand clearly who can and cannot qualify for our study. So with those examples in mind, what is a good population definition? We want to use clear, unambiguous, objective criteria to distinguish between population and non-population members. The population definition should be consistent with the needs of the audience requesting the marketing research project. For example, if we were doing a marketing research project for an advertising agency who's interested in people purchasing pet foods, the criteria that constitutes a pet food buyer might be quite different from an actual pet food manufacturer. So making sure that those objective criteria align with the needs of the particular client or company is essential. Finally, and it's desirable and not always needed, the population definition matches with other previous research so that the present study that we're about to undertake can be compared and contrasted with that previous research. Once we've defined the target population appropriately, we need to identify the sampling frame. The sampling frame is a literal physical tool that we're going to use to draw our sample from. In marketing, the most common examples are email lists, lists of home addresses, phone numbers, Facebook account names, Twitter account handles, and so on. Now, in a perfect world, we will have a sampling frame that perfectly overlaps with our population of interest. But this is almost never the case. Instead, there are discrepancies between what we have in our sampling frame and what our population of interest is. And that leads to what is called errors of inclusion and errors of omission. Let's talk about both. Let's imagine that our population of interest for an upcoming study is all customers who have been active on our teletherapy platform at least once in the last 30 days. This company provided to us as our sampling frame a list of 5,000 customer phone numbers. The phone numbers were collected from customers who paid their accounts after their 90-day free trial. So this company, like many other annual contract style companies, clearly had a free trial period, and people didn't have to provide their personal information like their phone number until the free trial expired, and then they actually had to pay. So our list is people who've obviously paid their accounts. Now, for everyone who's both in the population and in our sampling frame, that's great, right? There's an alignment between who we want to study and who's available in our sampling frame. However, there's definitely not going to be perfect overlap here. On one hand, there's going to be people that are in our population of interest that we don't have in our sampling frame. Those are called errors of omission. A couple examples might be, well, maybe the company simply just didn't provide us a complete customer list, just a random sample of 5,000. Very typical for a marketing research firm not to get the contact information of every single customer. This isn't really a problem at all. As long as the list that we got was random, we aren't really concerned that they didn't give us all of them. We weren't going to sample everyone anyways. But the other issue here is more problematic. Imagine there's some people who are still in their free trial period. However, because they're in their free trial period, there is no phone number yet because they don't give it until after their free trial period. So of course they can't be in the sampling frame. This is a problem, and that's an error of omission we're going to try to figure out how to deal with. Dealing with errors of omission can either be something we can completely ignore, or the reason that people are omitted from our sampling frame is actually non-random and totally relevant to the thing that we're studying. And that's a huge problem. For example, if we're trying to figure out who's going to re-up their annual service contract as part of our marketing research project, the fact that we haven't included people who have not yet ever paid for their service is a big important criteria. Those individuals who've never paid for a teletherapy contract yet are very unlikely relative to those who've already paid before to sign up. We need to include some of those people to get an accurate measurement. So what are some of the ways that we could deal with these types of problems? First, we should at least try to check, if possible, whether or not the errors of omission even are an issue. For example, we may know the demographic composition of the people in the population. We may also be lucky and have demographic composition of the information of the people in our sampling frame. We can compare those two. If there's no major discrepancies, that would imply that there's less risk of an error of omission. As we'll talk about later, if we know characteristics of both our population and our sample, we can apply something called sampling weights to our results during analysis to better calibrate our estimates. Again, this doesn't necessarily purely solve the problem, but it is a way to address it. A more straightforward approach would be to create additional sampling frames. Thinking back to the earlier example for the teletherapy, perhaps the company can provide to us another way of contacting, maybe email address, of those individuals who have yet to provide a telephone address. So by adding that additional sampling frame, hopefully we can recruit into our sample those individuals who should qualify. Finally, if we know there are issues of errors of omission that are significant and we weren't able to completely overcome them, the next best thing we can do is be honest in our reporting of our results about errors of omission. There's a second type of error that can happen when we're trying to align our population of interest and our sampling frame, and that's errors of inclusion. Those are people who are in our sampling frame, but they are not supposed to be there. An example might be we simply have wrong phone numbers provided to us, or we were provided a list of phone numbers of people who some of those individuals haven't actually been active in the last 30 days. Fortunately, dealing with errors of inclusion in a sampling frame are a bit easier than dealing with errors of omission. The biggest way to address errors of inclusion is to just make sure that you're always screening. ABS, always be screening. In other words, first thing you should do in your study is ask appropriate qualifying questions, making sure that those individuals who should be in your study actually do qualify. Now, another risk is people might be trying to actively lie their way into our study. So if that's the case, we might want to have some criteria in our study to check for or deal with so-called trolls or fake survey respondents. If someone's trying to fake their way into our study because they want, say, a particularly nice incentive, say like a $20 gift card, What we can usually do is towards the end of the study, we can provide a series of attention check or fake check questions that people who are less engaged in the study and are more focused on the incentive are likely to do. People who shouldn't be included in the study and are trying to fake their way into the study are often particularly prone to engaging in straight lining, where you give the same exact numerical answer to every question, or speeding through a survey particularly fast. We can check those things and verify and exclude those results after the fact and after we collect the data.